Dallas sat on a wooden stool, nursing his 3 fingers of whiskey. The ice in the drink had long since melted away, leaving only a swirling golden mixture. He gripped the glass, hoping that some of the leftover moisture would soothe the cracks in his dry hands. The whiskey within was just for show. He didn't drink on the job. The bar was low lit, with amber lights that reflected the dark wood paneling. Colorful bottles of spirits filled the shelves. Old country music emanated from the 1950s style radio at the end of the bar. The holes in the radio's fabric and the scratches on its dials would make you believe that it had been involved in some of the fights it had watched over the years. Regardless, it still sung its old school country tunes. This place had the same routine as all the other underground holes Dallas had been to. A dive bar smelling of dirt and cheap booze. The day shift workers would come in to shoot the shit until they had to go home to their wife or girlfriend, leaving only drifters and drunks to sit in miserable silence or wanting to start a fight. Dallas was waiting for that last part, the part where he could light a cigarette in the corner and get out of his seat. Dallas looked down to his chest pocket to remind himself of the Marlboro Blues, 5 cigarettes left. One was needed for leaving. That was a tip his grandfather had taught him. He could hear him in the back of his head now. You always have to leave in a cloud of smoke. They can't track you that way. You'll leave them gasping for air. That left 4 cigarettes to be enjoyed at his leisure. Dallas lit one up, and the lighter flame revealed his face. He wasn't handsome by Hollywood standards, but he had chiseled enough features. The bones in his cheeks were high, and his jaw was defined by a 2-day stubble. Dallas's milky blue eyes reflected the smoldering tip of the cigarette, and the smoke ran over his thin 6-foot frame. His jeans had holes in the knees. Dallas's brown denim jacket was kept together by hasty sewing jobs, and the yellow button-up shirt below was wrinkled. 2 men at the far end of the bar started getting in each other's faces and raising their voice. Dallas noticed it and tilted his gaze over to them, a tall skinny man and a short muscular man. The tall man pushed the short man and he fell backwards, crashing into a few bar stools. Dallas placed a mental bet on the shorter man, not because he was muscular, but because the short man was significantly shorter than average. The tall man laughed as he pushed the short man back down before he could get back up. This was the kind of fight Dallas came to the bars to watch. Sure, he got stuck in a few occasionally, but that was the price of admission. The show of violence was better than any song a musician could play. The short man finally scrambled to his feet and took up a basic boxing stance. The tall man mocked the short man, mimicking his seriousness of the fight. He slapped the short man and made fun of the way the short man protected his head. Dallas relished the thought of the tall man being drunk on his own ego. This was the easiest kind of guy to take down. Guys like the tall man had always won by overwhelming odds. Something in them gave them no thought of failure, no idea in their mind that death or serious harm was even a possibility. The tall man's fist hit the top of the short man's head and recoiled back. The shot hurt the tall man's hand much more than the short man's neck. Regardless, the skin still split on the short man's head and blood ran down his buzz cut. A group formed around the conflict and started shouting at the men to fight. The pain in the tall man's hand sobered him and he stopped laughing. Dallas had seen this 1,000 times before in 100 other bars, always winning by natural gifts alone. Never gave people the experience needed to fight a stronger opponent. They never had to count the odds or outthink their opponents instead of overpowering them. It made them easy pickings for guys like Dallas. Guys that had ways to bend the rules to their favor. The problem was that bending rules was difficult. It took time and familiarity. By the time you knew how to bend the rules, it might be too late. You'll be chasing your tail by then, and having to figure out ways to cover your losses. The short man threw a jab at the tall man's stomach to no visible effect. The tall man launched an open-handed shove into the short man's face, breaking the shorter man's nose. The short man's head rocketed back. The short man stepped back into the bar, rocking Dallas's drink. He pressed a thumb into his nose and blew out the clumped blood and snot onto the wooden floor. His scalp was leaking blood down his face, and the skin around the cut was pulled outwards now. The face of the shorter man was looser now, like he was older, and with wrinkles suddenly. Wrinkles was the wrong word. only a moment later as the structure of the face changed to a perverted masquerade of a man. His brow line was pushed downward into a hard V. The backs of his ears became pointed towards the ceiling. The vampire looked back up at the tall man, with protruding fangs in his mouth and blood-red eyes. The tall man stood with a confident smile. Dallas finished his first cigarette and moved on to the second. The man next to him started to cough. The vampire got close to the tall man and ducked a hook from the tall man. He stomped down on the tall man's foot. The tall man's foot let out a sickening crunch, and he yelled out in pain. The tall man swung up with an uppercut that gnashed the vampire's teeth together and split his gums. The vampire stumbled back and spit out a loose tooth from his now bright red mouth. He licked the blood off of his gums in a hungry fever. The tall man knelt down over his injured foot, planted his hands into the ground hard enough to feel the vibrations through Dallas' worn boots. The sound of the tall man's bones breaking and reforming timed to the rhythm of the radio's song. His fingernails shot out across the floor as paws replaced his hands. The tall man's clothes tightened around the wolf, taking his place, falling to shreds to reveal the growing mass of black fur and thick muscle underneath. The wolf's snout grew out of the tall man's face to reveal a row of bright white teeth dripping with saliva. The wolf let out a low growl and crouched low to the ground. Dallas blew out more smoke and was creating quite a cloud around himself now. He crushed his second cigarette and lit a third. The men around him had to move away. The bartender glared at him from across the room. He approached Dallas and motioned to Dallas's hands.
Hey buddy, you need to put that out.
The bartender's pointed ears and fangs were starting to show. The wolf lunged. The vampire reacted late and fell on his back with the wolf on top of him. Snapping jaws and teeth flashed in his face. Dallas continued to smoke like a train, puff after puff. The men around him were wheezing and falling off their chairs. The other patrons around the bar were taking their attention away from the fight and turning it towards Dallas now. Pointed ears and black fur started to appear around them.
You hear me, asshole?
The bartender spurted between wheezing coughs as he backed away from Dallas.
Put that shit out.
Dallas blew more smoke into the crowd at the bar. They backed away, coughing and waving the smoke away. The duo fighting on the ground were both doubled over in coughing fits now. Can you believe people used to think garlic and silver would scare y'all? Dallas said, tossing his third cigarette and lighting his fourth. A vampire made a dash after Dallas and almost reached him when Dallas exhaled a cloud of fresh smoke in its face. The vampire collapsed to the ground instantly and began clawing at his chest, desperately trying to get burning air out of its lungs. Sanctified tobacco, grown in the Pope's personal garden. I gotta say, this works almost as good as Granddaddy's crossbow, wouldn't y'all say? Dallas said with a smile as he exhaled more holy smoke. The bar's crowd made for the door. A few of them stumbled behind and fell down kicking and screaming. A few of them stopped moving entirely. Dallas looked around the now empty room before tucking his lit cigarette behind his ear, its warmth and smell spreading across his face. He lifted himself over the bar in one motion. The bartender was looking at him from the ground, shaking and coughing, his blood-red eyes glaring in hatred at Dallas's standing figure. Dallas walked towards him and knelt down. He got close to the bartender and spoke in his usual soft South Texas drawl. I ran into a fella up in Tennessee. Told me the big man himself is down here in Georgia.
I don't know shit,
the bartender said between breaths. The fella in Tennessee said that too. Dallas pulled a silver cross from around his chest. The bartender on the ground hissed and bore his fangs. How about now?
Hickory Stump. He's in Hickory Stump.
Dallas put the silver cross back under his shirt. He stood up and grabbed a top-shelf spirit before meeting the bar at his hips. Body-sized piles of ash now littered the floor in front of him. He pulled a road map out from his coat pocket, with hasty notes and drawings scrawled onto it. Dallas studied it, trying to find Hickory Stump. He grunted and patted his chest pocket, pulling out a pair of reading glasses. Hey, is Hickory Stump in Irwin or Turner County? The bartender wheezed, slowed in response. I guess it don't really matter, huh? Dallas muttered to himself, not taking his eyes off the map. The bartender sat up. His coughing became less. You think actual hickory grows in Hickory Stump? Seems like a weird name for a town. Dallas put the map back in his pocket, then rooted through the cash register, stuffing his pockets with loose bills and a mixture of change. He looked up to the gleaming bottles and pulled a bottle of tequila off the top shelf. The bartender leaned against the wooden counter of the bar, his voice returning from his formerly scorched throat.
You're so fucked. What are you gonna do, boy? Smoke 'em out?
Dallas put his reading glasses away and ran his hand through his salt and pepper hair, reaching for the dying butt of a cigarette tucked behind his ear. No, but I'll figure out a way to bend the rules. The rage in the bartender's eyes turned to begging terror as Dallas put the cigarette in his mouth once again. All he could do was watch as the sanctified tobacco burned away in front of Dallas Van Helsing's wide, toothy smile.